In 1972, Warren Buffett paid $25 million for a small California candy company. His partner, Charlie Munger, later called it the deal that changed everything they knew about investing. Not because of the factories, not because of the real estate, because of a checkerboard floor, a free sample at the counter, and a promise that never broke. While Fannie Farmer collapsed, while Whitman's changed hands again and again, while dozens of American candy makers cut corners to survive the 20th century, one family kept using the exact same recipes a widow named Mary C. brought with her from Canada in 1921. The same butter, the same cream, no shortcuts, even when shortcuts would have saved money, even when the whole country expected them to. So how did a 100-year-old candy shop survive the Depression, a world war, and a wave of corporate buyouts that destroyed almost everyone else in its industry? By refusing to change. This is the story of the one that didn't fall. Mary C. was 65 years old when her life started over. She had spent most of it in a small town called Gananoque in eastern Ontario, on the edge of the Thousand Islands, where she and her husband ran a modest hotel. It was there, in the hotel kitchen, that she began developing the candy recipes that would one day carry her name across an entire country she hadn't even moved to yet. Toffee, chocolate walnut fudge, peanut brittle, nothing fancy, nothing experimental, just butter, cream, sugar, and a level of patience most cooks didn't have the discipline to keep. In 1919, her husband died. 2 years later, her son Charles made her an offer that would reshape both their lives. Charles had already lived a hard, restless kind of youth. Trained as a pharmacist, running 2 drugstores in a mining town in northern Ontario, watching both of them burn down in a single summer forest fire. He pivoted to selling chocolate for a living, and somewhere in that work, he started studying one of Canada's most successful candy chains, a company called Laura Secord. He believed he could build something like it, but not in Canada. In California, where the economy was young, the population was exploding, and nobody yet had a candy brand people trusted the way they trusted their own grandmother's kitchen. So he asked his mother to come with him. Mary agreed. She packed up her recipes, left the only country she'd ever lived in, and followed her son 3,000 miles west with his wife Florence and their 2 children. They settled first in Pasadena, in a modest post-Victorian bungalow, and it was there, in a kitchen with a black and white checkerboard floor, that Mary began cooking candy for her son's new business. That floor would end up mattering more than anyone in that kitchen could have guessed. In November of 1921, Charles opened the first See's Candy shop at 135 Northwestern Avenue in Los Angeles. He didn't have a large budget or an established name. What he had was his mother's recipes and an instinct about what made a candy shop feel different from a candy factory. He recreated that black and white checkerboard pattern from the Pasadena kitchen floor as the design of his very first store, not knowing it would become one of the most recognized visual signatures in American retail. Inside, the approach was almost stubbornly simple. Every customer who walked through the door was greeted personally and offered a free sample before they'd spent a single cent. The candy itself was made in full view, in a kitchen suppliers came to describe using a phrase of their own invention. See's quality, because top quality wasn't a strong enough term for what Charles was demanding from them. Only the freshest butter, only real cream, no substitutes, regardless of what it cost him. Los Angeles in 1921 was a city in the middle of an enormous boom, filling with newcomers chasing work, sunshine, and a fresh start, not unlike the C family themselves. Word about the little candy shop with the checkerboard floor spread fast among a population hungry for something that felt honest and unhurried in a city changing overnight. Within a few years, there wasn't just one See's shop in Los Angeles. There was a dozen, including one inside the newly built, instantly famous Grauman's Chinese Theater. Charles See's core belief was never complicated, and he never dressed it up in business language. Only the finest ingredients would go into the candy. Customers would be treated like family, not transactions. And whatever it cost to keep that promise, the company would pay it. That promise was about to be tested by the 2 hardest decades in American history, By the 1930s, the checkerboard shops were no longer a Los Angeles curiosity. They were spreading up and down California, and the thing people remembered most wasn't the candy itself. It was the ritual of walking through the door. Every visit started the same way. A clerk in a crisp uniform would greet you by making eye contact, not by reciting a script. Before you'd even decided what to buy, a piece of candy was already in your hand, offered freely, no obligation attached. For a lot of families living through the hardest economic decade in American history, that small act of generosity meant something. It wasn't charity, it was respect. And it cost Charles C. real money to give it away, at a time when almost every other business in the country was cutting anything it could to survive. That decision to keep spending on quality while other businesses collapsed around them turned out to be the first real proof of what would become the company's defining trait. See's didn't just survive the Great Depression, it grew during it. While bank windows were being papered over and storefronts across Los Angeles sat dark, the checkerboard shops kept their lights on, kept their kitchens running, and kept handing out free samples to customers who, in some cases, could barely afford the candy itself. Then came the war. By the early 1940s, the ingredients that built See's reputation, butter, sugar, fresh cream, were among the most tightly rationed commodities in the United States. Every candy maker in the country faced the same brutal choice: cut the recipe to stretch what little you had, or make less candy and risk losing customers to competitors willing to compromise. Inside the company, the debate was heated. Watering down decades of trust felt like a betrayal of everything Mary C. had built her recipes on. But turning away paying customers during wartime felt like financial suicide. In the end, the company chose a strategy that looked, on paper, like it shouldn't have worked at all. They would keep using full-quality ingredients in whatever quantity rationing allowed, and simply make less candy. The math was unforgiving. Some days a shop would sell out within hours of opening. When the candy was gone, the doors closed for the day, sometimes before noon. No exceptions, no backroom stock, no lowered standards to keep the shelves full a little longer. What happened next surprised even the people running the company. Customers didn't get angry. They got in line earlier. Word spread through neighborhoods that if you wanted See's candy, you needed to show up at opening because by mid-morning it might already be gone. The scarcity didn't damage the brand. It proved the brand was telling the truth. In a country where nearly every manufacturer was quietly cutting corners under the cover of wartime shortages, See's had chosen the one path that couldn't be faked, and customers noticed the difference in every single bite. That wartime bet on honesty over volume became the company's clearest statement of identity, the one story employees would keep repeating for the next 80 years whenever anyone asked what made See's different. It wasn't a slogan invented by a marketing department. It was a decision made under real pressure, when the easy thing and the profitable thing were the exact same thing, and the company chose neither. By the post-war years, that reputation had turned into genuine momentum. In 1949, See's opened an enormous new candy kitchen at the corner of Market and Valencia in San Francisco, 15,000 square feet of production space, built not just to make candy, but to be seen making it. Radio spots and newspaper advertisements invited the public to come tour the building, watch the candy being made behind glass, and taste it fresh off the line. On opening day, more than 8,000 people showed up. Think about that number for a moment. 8,000 people showing up not for a sale, not for a giveaway, but simply to watch chocolate being made and to stand inside a building that smelled like butter and roasting sugar. That kind of turnout doesn't happen for a company people merely tolerate. It happens for a company people have decided to trust with something personal: a birthday, a holiday, a first date, a reward for good grades. See's had become, without ever chasing the label, part of how California families mark the good moments in their lives. Charles C.'s own son, Lawrence, had been just 9 years old when the company was founded. By the post-war boom, he was a grown man stepping into leadership of a business that had weathered a depression and a world war without ever breaking its core promise. The company he inherited wasn't the largest candy maker in America. It never would be. But it had something harder to build and easier to lose: a reputation that decades of hardship had only made stronger. What none of them could have known yet was that the next real threat to See's wouldn't come from rationing or from the economy or from a competitor with a bigger factory. It would come from an entire industry beginning to consolidate around them, one storied candy company after another quietly changing hands. And a quiet, unavoidable question the family would eventually have to face themselves. How long could a company stay this way, on its own, before someone came looking to buy it? Growth for most American brands in the 20th century meant one thing: get big, get everywhere, get there fast. See's took the opposite approach, and it would end up being one of the most important decisions the company ever made. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, as Charles See's sons took on greater responsibility for the business, the company expanded steadily up and down the West Coast. But it never franchised. While competitors across the restaurant and retail world were handing out licenses to independent operators and watching quality control slip a little further with every new signature on a contract, See's insisted on owning and operating every single shop itself. Every kitchen, every counter, every checkerboard floor, built to the same specifications as the first one in Los Angeles. That decision came at a real cost. Franchising is fast. It lets a brand multiply overnight using other people's capital and other people's labor. Owning every location yourself is slow, expensive, and demands a level of operational discipline most growing companies don't have the patience for. See's chose slow on purpose. The family understood something that wouldn't become conventional business wisdom for another 50 years. A shortcut in expansion is still a shortcut, no matter how far away from headquarters it happens. The result was a footprint that grew steadily rather than explosively. New shops opened first across greater Los Angeles, then up into the Bay Area, then out toward Nevada and Arizona, following the migration patterns of West Coast families rather than chasing national headlines. By the 1960s, the checkerboard box wasn't just a Los Angeles memory anymore. It had become something closer to a regional inheritance, passed from one generation of Californians to the next, and slowly making its way into neighboring states along the same highways. Families used to visit relatives and take vacations. Every new location was built to feel like a continuation of the original, not a diluted copy of it. The candy kitchens stayed visible behind glass. The free sample stayed non-negotiable. The recipes stayed untouched. For a company that could have used expansion as an excuse to standardize, simplify, or cut costs at scale, the way so many growing American brands did the moment they crossed from regional favorite into multi-state operation, See's treated every new shop as one more location that had to earn the right to use the family name. That discipline extended to the people hired to run these new locations. Employees weren't treated as interchangeable staff cycling through a franchise system. Many stayed with the company for decades, some for their entire working lives, carrying forward the same standards Charles C. had demanded from his very first hires back in 1921. For workers, that stability cut both ways. It meant real loyalty and real institutional memory built into every shop. It also meant See's was never going to be a company that offered the fast financial upside a franchise owner might dream about elsewhere. No independent ownership stake, no chance to build a small business empire of your own within the See's name. What the company offered instead was something rarer in retail, a job that didn't disappear when a corporate strategy shifted or a franchise agreement fell apart. By the time the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, See's had grown into a company with real scale. Hundreds of shops, a loyal, multi-generational customer base, and a reputation that extended well beyond California's borders. And that success had started attracting a different kind of attention. The American candy industry, once a landscape crowded with proud, independently run family companies, was entering an era of rapid consolidation. Storied names that had built their reputations the same way See's had. One shop, one family, one set of trusted recipes, were beginning to change hands, swallowed up by larger conglomerates chasing scale over character. See's had spent 5 decades proving it could survive scarcity, war, and a stubborn refusal to cut corners. What it hadn't yet faced was the one force that had already ended so many of its peers: the temptation or the pressure to sell. By the early 1970s, See's Candies had stopped being simply a successful regional company. It had become something closer to a shared inheritance, a brand that belonged not just to California, but to the idea of California itself: sunshine, optimism, and a promise that quality didn't have to be sacrificed for growth. The numbers alone told part of the story. Hundreds of shops now stretched across the West Coast and into neighboring states, each one built on the same checkerboard floor, each one still handing out free samples exactly the way Charles C. had insisted on it back in 1921. But the deeper story wasn't in the location count. It was in how deeply the ritual of C's had woven itself into the private, unrecorded moments of ordinary family life. Birthdays, anniversaries, a box of chocolates brought to a hospital room, a pound of peanut brittle mailed to a son stationed overseas. C's Candy had become the default answer to a question millions of Californians ask themselves without even thinking about it. What do you bring when you want to say something matters? Grandparents who had first tasted C's as children during the Depression were now the ones handing the same checkerboard box to their own grandchildren, continuing a habit that had quietly passed through 3 generations of the same families without anyone ever deciding to make it a tradition. It just became one. Inside the shops, working the counter at a C's location had its own kind of standing. Employees weren't hidden behind a counter, processing transactions as quickly as possible. They were expected to know regular customers by name, to remember which chocolate a particular grandmother always bought for her grandson, to make the free sample feel personal rather than routine. For many employees, especially the ones who stayed for decades, working at C's wasn't simply a job. It was a role inside a small, recurring performance of California hospitality that customers had come to expect and quietly depend on. The company's reputation didn't rest on advertising campaigns or celebrity endorsements. It rested on something harder to manufacture and impossible to fake at scale: consistency, repeated so many times across so many decades that it had turned into folklore. Ask a longtime Californian about C's, and they wouldn't describe a marketing slogan. They'd describe a specific memory: the smell of the shop, the exact flavor of a piece of Victoria toffee, the sound of the register, the particular way a clerk would ask what you were celebrating before ringing anything up. That kind of brand loyalty, built patiently over half a century without shortcuts, was rare in American retail even then. It would become far rarer in the decades to come, as more and more household names chased rapid national expansion, standardized their products to cut costs, and slowly lost the very specificity that had made customers love them in the first place. C's had taken the opposite path the entire time, and by the early 1970s, that patience had produced something almost no competitor in the candy industry could claim: a company that was profitable, beloved, and still, after 50 years, run essentially the same way it had been run on its very first day. It was precisely that rare combination, financial strength paired with an almost unbreakable customer loyalty, that was about to attract the attention of 2 men in Omaha, Nebraska, who were beginning to think about business in a way almost nobody else in America did yet. What they saw in C's wasn't a candy company at all. It was a case study in something they were only beginning to put a name to. By the early 1970s, the C family was facing a decision most successful family businesses eventually confront, and very few navigate without losing something essential in the process. The company was thriving, but the generation that had built it, Charles C.'s sons, who had spent their adult lives running the business their father and grandmother started in 1921, was aging, and the next generation wasn't positioned, or in some cases willing, to take on the responsibility of running hundreds of shops across multiple states. Family businesses at this exact crossroads tend to face a narrow set of outcomes, and almost none of them are gentle. Sell to a larger conglomerate looking to absorb the brand for its name recognition and risk the recipes, the culture, and the standards getting slowly diluted by executives who never understood why any of it mattered in the first place. Bring in outside professional management and risk the same slow erosion from the inside. Or keep pushing forward as a private family company, knowing that scale, competition, and time itself would eventually make that harder and harder to sustain. The candy industry around them offered a grim preview of how badly this crossroads could go. Storied American confectionery names, companies with the same kind of multi-generational customer loyalty See's had spent 50 years building, were being absorbed one after another into larger corporate structures. Fannie Farmer, Whitman's, companies that had once meant something specific to specific American families, the same way See's meant something to Californians, were beginning to lose their identities piece by piece as new owners prioritized cost-cutting and national distribution over the small, expensive rituals that had made these brands beloved in the first place. Free samples disappeared. Recipes got quietly reformulated to use cheaper ingredients. Shops that once felt like a neighborhood institution started to feel like every other shop in every other mall. There was no guarantee See's would end up any different. A sale to the wrong buyer, a conglomerate looking to strip costs, squeeze margins, and treat the brand as nothing more than a collection of assets to be optimized, could unravel in a single boardroom decision everything Charles C. and his mother Mary had spent half a century building. The free samples could be quietly discontinued as an unnecessary expense. The recipes could be improved for cost efficiency. The family-run culture that had defined every hire since 1921 could be replaced by standard corporate retail management. The same story that had already played out at company after company across the industry. The family understood the stakes with unusual clarity. Whoever eventually took over See's wouldn't just be buying a candy company. They would be inheriting the responsibility of either preserving something rare or becoming the next name on a long list of once beloved American brands that got bought out and quietly hollowed from the inside. What the C family didn't yet know was that two investors in Omaha were about to make them an offer built on a philosophy almost nobody else in American business was practicing at the time, one that treated brand loyalty itself as the most valuable asset a company could own, worth protecting rather than exploiting. Whether that offer would save the company or simply become one more chapter in the same sad pattern playing out across the candy industry was about to be decided in a negotiation that would later be remembered as one of the most important deals in American business history. In late 1971, a small group of investors approached the C family with an offer to buy the company. Leading that group were two men from Omaha, Nebraska, Warren Buffett and his partner, Charlie Munger. At the time, Buffett was already a successful investor, but not yet the household name he would later become. What he was looking for wasn't simply a profitable company. He was looking for something far rarer, something he and Munger had only recently started putting a precise name to. A business with a durable competitive advantage, a moat, strong enough to protect it from competitors indefinitely. Buffett's investment career up to that point had been built almost entirely on a different philosophy, buying troubled, undervalued companies purely for the assets on their balance sheet, regardless of how good or bad the underlying business actually was. See's represented something fundamentally different, and Munger was the one who pushed hardest for Buffett to see it. See's didn't have especially valuable factories or real estate. What it had was something far harder to quantify on a spreadsheet. 5 decades of relentless customer loyalty, built one free sample and one unbroken recipe at a time. The asking price was $25 million. Buffett and Munger's initial valuation, based on the company's physical assets alone, came in well below that. By the strict numbers first standards Buffett had used his entire career, the deal looked expensive, maybe even foolish. Munger disagreed and pushed back hard. He argued that See's earning power, its pricing power, and above all, its brand loyalty were worth paying a premium for, that the ability to raise prices year after year without losing a single customer was a kind of value no balance sheet could fully capture. Buffett later admitted the negotiation nearly fell apart over a difference of just a few $1,000,000, a gap that in hindsight would look almost absurd given what the investment would go on to return. In the end, the two sides settled at $25 million, and the deal closed in January 1972. It was, by Buffett's own later account, one of the most important purchases of his career, not because of the size of the transaction, but because of what it taught him. See's became the company that changed how Warren Buffett thought about investing for the rest of his life, shifting his entire philosophy away from buying cheap, mediocre businesses and toward paying a fair price for truly wonderful ones. For the C family, the sale marked the end of 50 years of direct family ownership, but it did not mark the end of the company's identity, and that distinction turned out to be the difference between survival and slow erosion. What happened next inside C's stood in sharp, almost defiant contrast to the pattern playing out across the rest of the candy industry. Buffett and Munger made an unusual promise, one that ran directly against the standard playbook for a corporate acquisition. They would not interfere with the recipes. They would not cut ingredient quality to boost margins. They would not eliminate the free samples, even though eliminating them would have been an easy and visible way to improve short-term profitability. Existing management stayed in place. The checkerboard floors stayed exactly as they were. Mary C's original recipes from 1921 stayed untouched, guarded almost like a founding document rather than a formula that could be quietly improved by a new corporate parent looking to cut costs. This was, in its own quiet way, radical. Across the same decades, the American business world was entering the early stages of an era defined by leveraged buyouts and private equity strategies. A playbook that would go on to devastate company after company, profiled elsewhere in this very story. Load a newly acquired business with debt, strip its real estate through sale-leaseback deals, squeeze suppliers, squeeze workers, squeeze quality, and extract as much value as possible before the whole structure collapsed under its own weight, leaving employees and loyal customers to deal with the wreckage. That approach would go on to gut storied companies across American retail and dining for the rest of the 20th century. Buffett and Munger chose the opposite path entirely. Their thesis wasn't that C's needed fixing. Their thesis was that C's had already found something correct, something the company had been quietly proving for 50 straight years, and that the single greatest risk to that value wasn't stagnation. It was outside interference from new owners who didn't understand what they'd actually purchased. Under Berkshire Hathaway's ownership, C's was allowed to keep operating almost exactly as it always had. Prices rose steadily over the following decades, a strategy Buffett would later cite publicly as proof of the brand's extraordinary pricing power. Customers kept buying year after year, even as the cost of a box of chocolates climbed well ahead of general inflation. Profits were reliably reinvested into the business rather than extracted and stripped out. The company's culture of long-tenured, deeply loyal employees stayed intact. C's became something close to a living case study, cited for decades afterward in business schools and shareholder letters as proof that some brands are worth more precisely because of what a new owner chooses not to do to them. The deal that had nearly collapsed over a disagreement of a few $1 million ended up becoming one of the most profitable and most frequently cited investments in American business history. Not because C's was reinvented under new ownership, but because it wasn't. In an era when so many beloved American companies were being bought, gutted, and hollowed out from the inside, C's had, almost by accident, found the one kind of buyer capable of leaving well enough alone. But being protected from corporate mismanagement didn't mean the company was protected from everything. The next real test wouldn't come from a boardroom decision. It would come from an entire century moving on without them, and from a crisis unlike anything C's had faced since the rationing years of the Second World War. For nearly 50 years after the Buffett acquisition, C's continued operating with a kind of stubborn consistency that made it almost invisible to the broader currents reshaping American retail. While bookstores, department stores, and entire shopping mall ecosystems were being upended, first by big box competition and then by e-commerce, C's kept doing what it had always done, selling candy across the counter, one free sample at a time, mostly within driving distance of where it had always sold candy. That consistency, the very thing that had protected the brand for decades, eventually became its own kind of vulnerability. By the early 2000s, the retail landscape C's had spent 80 years perfecting was disappearing underneath it. Shopping malls, where many C's locations had anchored their business for generations, began entering a long, well-documented decline as American shoppers migrated online. Younger consumers, raised on same-day delivery and endless product comparison, had far less patience for a business model built entirely around walking into a physical shop and asking a clerk what was good that day. Mass market candy had also changed. Cheap, heavily marketed confectionery brands produced at industrial scale and sold everywhere from gas stations to big box retailers flooded the market with rock-bottom prices See's had never tried to compete with. The company's entire business rested on the opposite proposition. Pay more because what you're getting is made differently and made with real ingredients the same way it had been made since 1921. That message required real belief from a customer, and belief is a harder thing to sustain in a country increasingly trained to shop by price comparison alone. C's response was cautious, incremental, and true to form. Rather than chasing every retail trend or slashing prices to compete directly with mass market candy, the company slowly built out its own online ordering system, allowing customers who no longer had a shop within easy driving distance to still receive the same boxes their grandparents had once bought in person. It was a compromise the company approached carefully, aware that shipping candy nationally risked diluting exactly the kind of personal, in-person ritual that had built the brand in the first place. The free sample, after all, doesn't translate easily to a cardboard box left on a doorstep. Then in early 2020, a threat arrived that no strategic plan had ever accounted for. The COVID-19 pandemic did something to See's that neither the Great Depression nor the Second World War had fully managed to do. It closed nearly every shop the company operated, almost overnight. Retail locations across California and the rest of the West Coast went dark under public health orders, cutting off the exact in-person ritual that had defined the brand for a full century. For a business built so completely around walking through a door, being personally greeted, and being handed a sample before you'd even chosen what to buy, a mandatory shutdown of physical retail wasn't just a financial emergency, it struck at the very identity of the company. Inside See's, the crisis forced decisions with real consequences for real people. Thousands of retail employees, many of them long-tenured workers who had spent years or even decades behind a See's counter, were furloughed or laid off as shops went dark with no clear timeline for reopening. For a company that had always prided itself on treating employees like family, a value going back to Charles See's very first hires in 1921, those layoffs were a painful departure from 100 years of stated principle, even as leadership publicly framed them as the only path to keeping the company alive long enough to reopen at all. What followed was less a single dramatic turning point than a slow, uneven climb back toward normal. One that revealed just how much the company's decades of accumulated trust was actually worth when it mattered most. Online orders, which the company had built out cautiously over the preceding years almost as an afterthought, suddenly became the primary lifeline, keeping revenue flowing while physical shops sat closed. Customers who could no longer walk into a store proved willing to order online in numbers the company hadn't fully anticipated, a signal that the loyalty built over a century of in-person ritual could, when necessary, survive being moved onto a screen. It wasn't the same experience. There was no clerk asking what you were celebrating, no sample placed in your hand before you decided what to buy. But the underlying trust in the product itself, the specific taste people had grown up with, the exact recipe that hadn't changed since Mary C. first developed it, carried the brand through a period when the ritual that built it was, for the first time in 100 years, temporarily impossible. As shops gradually reopened through 2021 and into 2022, See's made a deliberate decision that echoed the same instinct the company had relied on during wartime rationing 80 years earlier. Rather than permanently cutting costs learned during the crisis or using the disruption as cover to quietly shrink quality, leadership worked to restore the full in-person experience as quickly as public health conditions allowed. The free sample came back. The personal greeting came back. Shops that had gone dark reopened with the same checkerboard floors, the same recipes, the same insistence on ingredients that couldn't be substituted for something cheaper. One longtime employee who had worked behind a See's counter in the Bay Area for over 2 decades before the pandemic forced a temporary layoff, later described returning to the shop after reopening as walking back into a version of her own life that had simply been paused rather than erased. Regular customers she'd known by name for years came back within weeks, some of them relieved almost to the point of emotion that the shop, and the woman behind the counter were both still there. It was a small, individual moment, repeated in different forms at counters up and down the West Coast. Proof that whatever the pandemic had taken from the company financially, it hadn't managed to take the relationships built over decades between specific employees and specific customers. By the time the worst of the pandemic had passed, See's had endured the most serious operational disruption in its 100-year history without abandoning the principles that had defined it since 1921. The company that emerged wasn't unchanged. It now depended on e-commerce in ways it never had before, and it had been forced for the first time to lay off longtime employees it had always prided itself on protecting. But it had survived without doing the one thing that had destroyed so many other beloved American brands under real financial pressure. It never touched the recipe, and it never stopped believing the free sample was worth the cost. The test hadn't come from a hostile takeover, or a private equity firm, or a boardroom decision to cut corners for short-term profit. This time, the test had simply been survival itself. And once again, against a threat far larger than the company, See's had come through it still recognizably, stubbornly, itself. Look at what happened to the rest of the American candy industry over the same 100 years, and the story of See's starts to look less like an isolated success and more like a pointed exception to almost every rule. Fannie Farmer, once one of the most recognized candy names in the country, changed ownership repeatedly through the second half of the 20th century, before effectively disappearing from the market. Its recipes and reputation diluted across a series of corporate parents who valued the name more than what had built it. Whitman's, the company behind the once iconic sampler box, went through its own long chain of acquisitions, eventually becoming a smaller, quieter presence than the household name it once was. Across the broader candy and confectionery industry, the story repeated itself with remarkable consistency. A beloved regional brand built on real quality and personal loyalty, bought by a larger company chasing scale, slowly stripped of the specific details that had made it worth buying in the first place, until what remained was a label with none of the substance behind it. See's followed almost none of that pattern, and the reason wasn't luck. It was a series of specific, repeated decisions made across a full century by different people facing different pressures that all pointed in the same direction. During the Depression, spend more rather than less. During wartime rationing, sell less candy rather than worse candy. When approached about a sale in the early 1970s, choose the buyer who promised not to interfere over the buyer who might have offered more money. And when a global pandemic shut down the entire retail model the company had run on for 100 years, rebuild the original experience rather than permanently replace it with something cheaper to operate. None of those choices were obvious or easy in the moment they were made. Each one came with a real, quantifiable cost, and a more conventional business would likely have made the opposite call at least once along the way. That's precisely what makes See's useful as an object lesson rather than simply a nostalgic story. It demonstrates, with a full century of evidence, what actually happens when a company treats trust as an asset worth protecting at real financial costs, rather than a soft value to be sacrificed the moment a balance sheet needs improving. Warren Buffett himself has pointed to See's for decades as the investment that changed how he thought about value itself. Proof that a brand's earning power, built entirely on decades of consistency, can be worth more than any factory or patent a company might own. Business schools still study the 1972 acquisition as a case study in recognizing intangible value before the rest of the market does. But the more interesting lesson may not be about Buffett's investment philosophy at all. It may simply be about what happens to a 100-year-old promise when nobody across 4 separate generations of ownership ever decides it's worth breaking. Today, See's operates more than 250 shops, still concentrated most heavily across California and the American West, still using recipes that trace directly back to Mary C's kitchen in Pasadena in 1921. The checkerboard floor is still there. The free sample is still there. And somewhere in one of those shops today, a grandparent is almost certainly handing a checkerboard box to a grandchild who has no idea they're holding the same candy, made the same way that their great-great-grandparents might have bought on that very first day on Western Avenue. What does it mean that one company managed to keep a century-old promise in an industry where almost nobody else did? There is a particular smell that belongs to a C's shop, and anyone who grew up walking into one would recognize it instantly, even blindfolded, even decades later. Butter and roasting sugar in something faintly like a kitchen on a holiday morning. It is the smell of a checkerboard floor underfoot and a clerk already reaching for a sample before you've said a word. It is the sound of a box being tied with string rather than tape, the particular weight of chocolate in a hand, the small ceremony of choosing between the dark and the milk when both are offered freely and neither one cost you anything yet. Picture Los Angeles in November of 1921. A widow from a small town in Ontario, 65 years old, has just crossed an entire continent with nothing but her recipes and her son's belief in her. The shop is small. The city outside is loud with construction and ambition, a place remaking itself daily. Inside, the kitchen smells exactly the way it will smell 100 years later, because nobody in that room, across 4 generations, in one of the most famous business transactions in American history, will ever agree to change it. What C's actually sold was never really candy. Candy was the vehicle. What the company sold without ever needing to say so in an advertisement was the specific comfort of something that stays exactly as it was when you first loved it. A birthday gift that tastes the same as it did when you were 7. A box mailed to a hospital room that carries somehow the memory of every other box that ever meant the same thing. A grandmother's hand placing a piece of toffee into a grandchild's palm, continuing a gesture she can't remember learning because it was simply always there, passed down the way a family recipe is passed down. Not written, just repeated until repetition becomes inheritance. Most companies that reach 100 years get there by becoming something different from what they started as. Bigger, cheaper, faster, more convenient, less particular about the details nobody outside the company ever seems to notice missing. C's took a stranger, harder road. It became 100 years old by refusing again and again, at exactly the moments when refusing was expensive, to become anything other than what Mary C. and her son Charles built on a modest street in Los Angeles. Through a depression that emptied the pockets of half the country, through a war that made honesty about ingredients a genuine financial risk, through the arrival of an owner with more money and more power than the entire company was worth, who could have changed anything he wanted and chose deliberately to change nothing, through a pandemic that closed every door the company had. That kind of consistency is not glamorous, and it rarely makes headlines. It doesn't produce a dramatic collapse worth mourning or a cautionary tale worth warning the next generation about. It produces something quieter and, in its own way, harder to build. An unbroken thread running from a bungalow kitchen in Pasadena to a shop counter today, still handing out the exact same sample, still using the exact same recipe, still treating a stranger walking through the door the way Charles C. treated the very first customer who ever did. Somewhere today, in a shop that looks almost exactly like it did decades ago, someone is being handed a piece of candy they didn't ask for and don't have to pay for, simply because that is what happens when you walk through that particular door. They may not know the story behind it. They don't need to. The gesture carries the history inside it, whether or not anyone stops to explain where it came from. This is not a story about loss, the way so many stories like it turn out to be. It is a story about the rarer, quieter thing, a promise made in 1921, kept through everything that might have broken it, still being kept today by people who never met the woman who made it first. Somewhere tonight, a family is opening a checkerboard box, and for a moment, without knowing it, they are tasting exactly what Mary C. intended a century ago. Proof that some things, if someone simply insists on it, really can stay the way you remember them.